The one thing I want to tell you is that if you are a Vietnam veteran, thank you. You didn't get thanked when you came home. It's been a thorn in our side ever since we made that mistake. I was really just a kid, but I was aware of it. I mean, I knew of all the protests and then the stories that you would hear about the soldiers who were reluctant to even wear their uniform as they returned home. Jan K. Herman is on the phone. He served as the historian for the Navy Medical Department and special assistant to the Surgeon General for 33 years. He produced the Lucky Few documentary and has written a book also called The Lucky Few, The Fall of Saigon and the Rescue Mission of the USS Kirk. We're talking about April 30th. What would that be? April 30th. Thursday is the 40th anniversary of the fall of Saigon. Wow, hard to believe. And by the way, tomorrow, just a sub note, there's the Jefferson airplane, the Jefferson Starship, is performing down in the Villages. They're doing a concert, and it's free.
Yes.
And the interesting, I don't know that I would call it an irony, but you remember the whole Woodstock thing was anti-war, and they will still say they were anti-war, but he's adamant about not being. And he's not anti-soldier.
Yes.
Those guys. We spoke to one of them yesterday. I mean, just very respectful of the Vietnam vets.
And it's all for the Vietnam veterans. The concert is.
Right. It's
everything.
Actually, it's called a salute. Let me just look real quick. Mm-hmm. It's called a salute to America. Yeah. So it's tomorrow. Jan Herman, it's an honor to have you on our show. Good morning, Jan.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Where are you right now?
I live in Tacoma Park, Maryland, just outside Washington, D.C.
Wow. Do you know, I remember when this was on the news. Like I say, I was a kid, but an old enough kid to know what was going on. I mean, obviously, for years you heard, you know what I would hear, and everybody who was in school at that time remembers hearing on the announcements of the morning. If you lived in a big enough school, you heard this all the time. Robin, you and I discussed this before. You would hear them announce the fallen, the soldiers who died, who used to go to that school. I can remember those announcements, and you always would think that's going to be me one day. They're going to say my name. Mm-hmm. You know?
Yes.
And so I was one of the fortunate few that you're talking about here.
Too young to be involved in the war.
Yeah, yeah. So tell me about yourself. Are you a Vietnam vet?
I am a veteran. I did not go to Vietnam. I was in the U.S. Air Force during the Vietnam War, and ended up working for the Navy. Even though I had been in the Air Force, I ended up working for the Navy for all those years.
Oh, wow. Well, thank you for your service. So the Lucky Few, who were the Lucky Few?
The Lucky Few, that title came from a Vietnam refugee that I interviewed for the film, for the documentary you mentioned. His name was Joseph Pham, and we were having a conversation. And many of these refugees, in fact, most of them who now live in this country as American citizens many, many years later, are so grateful for having been given a second chance, and this time in freedom. The fact that they were rescued, they managed to get to the United States. And Mr. Pham told me, he said he considered himself to be among the lucky few. And I asked him at the time, I said, I'm looking for a title. I love that. Would it be okay if I use that? He said he'd be honored to have me use it. So I use it both for the film and the book.
That is very cool. And I didn't know that part of the story. So, I mean, when you think about what we did, even to this day, you still hear people arguing about whether it was the right thing to do. That right there sounds like it was the right thing to do. I mean, we were trying to preserve people's right to have a good life.
Right. Of course, the war was, as many of your listeners who are old enough to remember, was the most divisive war we had been in since probably the Civil War in the 1860s. It tore the nation asunder. You mentioned that a little earlier in your remarks. It was a war that was very unpopular, and it ended badly. And this is one of those stories, and there aren't many of them. This is one of the stories that has a happy ending. These sailors who were crew members of the USS Kirk, involved in this rescue operation, in essence, they were trained as warriors. They had gone to Vietnam aboard this warship with the express purpose of most likely being involved in combat. Mm-hmm. And with the snap of a finger, the situation changed. It was a matter of not killing any longer. It was a matter of trying to save human lives. And these sailors did a remarkable job in that very brief instant converting themselves into humanitarian assistance givers.
Wow. So how did that play out? I mean, how do you rescue people when you're on a ship like that? Do you take small boatloads and bring them back to the ship? How does that work?
Well, the way it operated at that time, there was a flotilla of 40 Navy ships offshore, off the South Vietnamese coast. This would have been in April, late April, right around now, 40 years ago. And those ships were there for a purpose. They were there to evacuate whatever Americans were still in Vietnam, especially in Saigon. And Vietnamese who had helped us, whose lives would not be worth very much once the North Vietnamese took over. They'd be singled out for retribution. And so the plan was to send in helicopters from these ships, several aircraft carriers, amphibious assault ships, ships that can handle large helicopters, to go into Vietnam and pick these people up in Saigon and bring them back out, and then go back and create a shuttle mission, so to speak. And this is what went on. These helicopters went out, and as the large American helicopters went back out to sea to land on their ships, these guys looked in their rearview mirrors and saw hundreds and hundreds of South Vietnamese helicopters following them.
Oh, wow.
Small helicopters, little Hueys. A helicopter designed to carry maybe 10 or 12 people were loaded down with 25 or 30, some people hanging from the skids of these helicopters.
And that's how it ended up being 32,000? I mean, because that's...
No. What happened was, this was the first phase of this operation. Anyway, the Kirk was able to take some of these small helicopters aboard. They landed on their helicopter deck. And then they took the people off, and then they threw the helicopters into the sea to make room for more.
Wow.
And this went on for about a day, and they took about 150 people. The following day, these people were sent to another ship, a larger ship. And then the Kirk got an order in the middle of the night over the radio telephone to come alongside the flagship. They were going to be sent on a special mission. And that mission was to go back to the coast of Vietnam, an island off the coast where the remnants of the South Vietnamese Navy would be waiting for them, 32 ships that were still left. And the Kirk's job, its mission now, was to escort these ships across the South China Sea to safety in the Philippines. Well, when they got to the island the following morning and the sun came up, they looked, and there were the 32 ships as expected. What they hadn't counted on were the decks were loaded with roughly 30,000 refugees, men, women, children, without water, without food, without adequate medical care.
Wow.
And one of the sailors of the Kirk said it reminded him of taking a Hershey bar and putting it on a hot summer sidewalk and coming back in an hour and seeing it crawling with ants. He says that's what those ships looked like.
Wow.
It looked like they were crawling around. Those were people. And so the real story is how did the Kirk, with only 2 medical personnel aboard, who suddenly now had 30,000 patients to deal with, how did the Kirk manage to get those people cared for and get them to safety in the Philippines? That's the real story.
Wow.
So they didn't take the 30,000 aboard the Kirk. What they did was they escorted those ships with those 30,000 people across the South China Sea.
I see.
Yeah.
And did those 32,000 refugees end up in America, or did they go to a variety of places?
Well, most of them ended up on the island of Guam, where there were refugee camps hastily set up to accommodate them. From Guam, many of them, or all of them, were taken to the U.S. and put in refugee camps that were rapidly set up here. There was one at Camp Pendleton, California, the Marine base, Fort Indian Town, Pennsylvania, another camp in Fort Chaffee, Arkansas, and 2 other camps.
Were the families intact, or were they?
Some were, some weren't. They had been separated. Many families had been separated by the chaos of the departure and were reunited. Some of them end up in different refugee camps, but the Red Cross was very good, and the Navy and other government agencies very good in getting people back together again. Now, it didn't mean that all families survived intact. Many families had members that remained in Vietnam, were not able to get out. And many of them, it took years, some cases 15, 20 years, to get those people to the United States. But many of them, the majority of them settled in the United States, became citizens of the United States. But there are communities within the U.S. today where you see high concentrations of Vietnamese Americans. Orange County, California is an example, a large community there. New Orleans, Dallas, Houston, the Washington metropolitan area, and Seattle. But there are also Vietnamese who settled in other countries.
Huh.
Believe it or not.
We must have some here. I know there's in fact, there was something on Facebook. We have a new Vietnamese restaurant opening up. So I don't know if there's a connection there with the refugees or not. Wow, this is a fascinating story. I'm looking forward to reading the book and to seeing the documentary. Jan, we need to take a little break and we'll be right back. By the way, the phone line is open for the listeners. If you want to call in, you are definitely invited to do that. I know we have a lot of Vietnam veterans who listen to the show, so don't hesitate. Don't be shy. 622-9622 is the number. Jan K. Herman is our guest. We'll take a break and be right back with Jan.
The weather is brought to you by myfwc.com. Safe boating is no accident. It'll be mostly cloudy today with a couple of showers and thunderstorms. Any thunderstorm can produce flooding, downpours, and damaging wind gusts later today. The high 77 to 81. Mostly cloudy tonight with a couple of showers and a thunderstorm around those 67 to 71. Tomorrow mostly cloudy and breezy with a couple of showers and heavy thunderstorms. The high 82 to 86. From the Florida Weather Center, I'm meteorologist Joe Lundberg.
It's the end of the fiscal year, and that means budget cuts and number crunching. Now's the time of the year you're evaluating your expenses, planning your budget, and finding ways to save money and increase efficiency to maximize profits. Dex Imaging understands and delivers. Call Dex Imaging today for a free document management evaluation. Cutting your office expenses is as easy as calling Dex Imaging. 352-266-0333. Start saving money today and increase your bottom line with Dex Imaging. Printers, copiers, and fax machines that increase office productivity and save you money. No one understands your bottom line better. Call Dex Imaging today, 352-266-0333, or check them out on the web at deximaging.com. That's DEXimaging.com. Or call 352-266-0333 for your free document management evaluation today.
What you may have missed on the John Tesh Radio Show.
If your toddler seems to end up wearing more of their food than they eat, don't freak. Messy eaters, we now know, they tend to pick up languages more easily. Instead, our biggest dementia risk boils down to the foods we eat. Stay away from red meat, butter, sweets, and fried food. If you're trying to make a good impression on a man, do not worry about small flaws in your appearance like a chipped fingernail or a stain on your shirt, because chances are he won't even notice.
Intelligence for your life on the John Tesh Radio Show. Don't miss this stuff.
All right, 18 minutes after 11 o'clock. Thank you for tuning in. Jan K. Herman is on the phone. He served as the historian of the Navy Medical Department and special assistant to the Surgeon General for 33 years. He is a veteran of both the Air Force and the Navy. He has written a book and produced a documentary called The Lucky Few, and it's about the fall of Saigon and the rescue mission of the USS Kirk and 32,000 refugees that fled the communist forces in Vietnam. April 30th, 2015 is the 40th anniversary of the fall of Saigon, so 40 years ago, this is all coming down. You know, during the break, Jan, I went to the Google Images thing, and I found a picture of the sailors pushing one of the helicopters off the side of the boat.
Yes, a very iconic picture. If you were around at that time and you watched the news at night, not only did you get those announcements that you mentioned earlier, but you would see at the very end, you'd see lots of these helicopters being pushed over the side to make room for more. It was such a chaotic scene. And each one of those helicopters, those Hueys, probably worth about $3.5 million. They would go over the side. But as Captain Jacobs of the Kirk said to me, he said, we didn't consider that at all. Human lives were much more valuable than any kind of helicopter or machine that we pushed into the ocean.
Wow, so they're all down there still.
Just at the bottom of the South China Sea, hundreds of them.
Wow.
I'm sure they're not in very good condition.
I do remember when the Vietnamese were brought here, and they were brought to Orlando, Florida, and they had to assimilate into our communities, and they were given clothing, they were given places to live, and most of them knew English, but some of them had to have special tutors so they could function in everyday life. And it was really wonderful, the outstretched pouring of hands for the Americans living here that gave them a chance.
Yes. Yes, and I've gotten to know many of those folks, and now the original refugees who have come here have now had families. Are some of them are grandparents now, and I've gotten to know their families. And in fact, there was one woman who was rescued by the Kirk. She was 16 years old at the time she was rescued. She had been separated from her husband, who was in the South Vietnamese Air Force, and in the chaos of the departure, they somehow got separated. She did have her mother with her, and they ended up on the Kirk, and she was in her 9th month of pregnancy when she got aboard the Kirk, and there were 6 or 7 other women who were brought aboard the ship. The thought was that they would probably, at least one of those women would give birth aboard the ship while they were making the transit across to the Philippines. It turns out that none of them did, but Lan Tran, the woman I just mentioned, she did give birth to her daughter at the Naval Hospital in Guam when they got to the refugee camp in Guam, and she was so touched by the fact that she had been rescued and given another chance that she named her daughter after the ship. And so there's this 40-some-odd-year-old woman who's now a mother herself who lives in California, who has a long Vietnamese name, but her middle name is Kirk.
Oh, her middle name, okay.
Oh, wow.
When she was a teenager growing up, she didn't know the story. Her mother hadn't told her the story. She was under the impression she was named for Captain Kirk from the Enterprise.
Oh, wow.
And her mother finally had to set her straight and say, no, you're not named for that, Kirk. You're named for the ship that brought us to safety.
Oh, that is awesome. That's a great story. So is the book the book version of the documentary, or are they two different things?
The book is a longer version of the documentary, which, by the way, is available on YouTube. Any of your listeners who want to see the documentary can just go to Google and put in "The Lucky Few documentary," and you'll see the whole 1-hour film.
Oh my goodness, I'm doing this. I want to see this.
You want to see it? Normally, the Hollywood model is you write the book and then you make the movie. I just did it backwards.
But how did you get the footage? I mean, did you have to get old footage, or did you recreate some of the scenes? How did you do it?
No, a lot of people thought there were these combat photographers who were aboard these ships, and there were on some of the larger aircraft carriers. But the Kirk didn't have a combat photographer. It had 3 very skilled amateur shutterbugs aboard, who were very, very good with a camera, and they took a lot of photographs, many of them wonderful, which we used in our documentary. And also a plug, tonight there's going to be a show on public television called Last Days of Vietnam, a documentary made by Rory Kennedy for the American Experience series. There are 12 minutes in that film that will be shown this evening, at least here in these parts, and maybe so in Florida also, that have 12 minutes of Super 8 film that one of the sailors aboard on the Kirk took. He found them after I made my documentary.
Wow.
Film in his attic, and Rory Kennedy was able to use it in her film. I wish I'd had it at the time, but it's about 12 minutes of it will be seen or will be shown on that documentary this evening. So
this evening. Oh, wow.
This had to be extremely emotional for you, sir, when you did the documentary and then put it down on paper in a book, because it had to have had reflections of your memories.
It really did. It's a very emotional story for many reasons. It's a heartwarming story for many reasons because, again, I've had Vietnamese tell me, ones who were aboard the Kirk way back, who, as they tell it, there are tears in their eyes when they show the gratitude of having been rescued. And equally, the sailors aboard the Kirk, who at the time didn't think they had done anything particularly extraordinary. They're typical American service people. We were only doing our jobs. That's what we did. And when they came back from Vietnam, they didn't even tell their families about it. But
wow.
in recent years, within the last 10, 15 years, as they've met some of the people they've rescued, and I've been to some of these reunions, and I have to tell you, they're very emotional. There's a lot of hugging and kissing going on, and a lot of gratitude. The sailors get to see the people they rescued because they didn't know what happened to them eventually. And the people who were rescued get a chance to, again, say thank you to these American who are no longer young men. They're now in their late middle age, and yet there's so much affection between these people that they now see each other regularly. And I got wrapped up in all of that. I got wrapped up hearing the stories firsthand. It's one thing to read about it in a book. It's another to actually talk to these people and hear about their experiences and get to experience that through them.
Do you know, on Thursdays we have a show that we air here on WOCA. It's a veterans show, and it's hosted by veterans, and the veterans come in here, and they spend time during this show. And one time the host of the show asked the Vietnam vets in the room to just share their memories of Vietnam, and not one of them mentioned a bullet or a gunfire or a battle. They all were. There was a couple of them that were wounded in Vietnam, but they would talk about the beautiful sunrises. They would talk about things about the culture of the people that they would meet there. It was weird to hear them talk about it. And then after they did all this and it wasn't planned, the host said to me, he said, "Isn't that interesting how not one of them mentioned the war?" They all mentioned the country, the beauty of the natural part of the country.
Yes. Oh.
I don't know if maybe that's a psychological thing. Maybe they're just to block out the stuff that we shouldn't remember. I don't know.
I think a large part of that is you can get veterans who get together on these reunions. They never talk. At least the ones I've been to don't talk about the combat. They talk about the funny stories, the things they remember that they look back with some fondness. And they seem to push that other more unpleasant experiences. They push that beneath the surface.
Wow. Well, I don't think I've ever been so moved to want to watch a documentary or read a book as I have with this interview. And then there's a secondary thing tonight on PBS. Are you involved with that one?
Oh well, I helped Rory Kennedy in making the film, although. I think I'm in the credits, but I didn't make the film. She did. She did a very, very good job. In fact, the film was nominated for an Academy Award this year, and it didn't get the Academy Award, but it was nominated for Best Documentary. So I've seen it, and it's a wonderful film, and I think your audience might like to see it also.
When you go to the reunions, are there future generations there that just grew up in the United States and had no involvement in that? And in that leaving, and do they grasp the importance of this?
I think they do. There are a lot of young people that I've talked to who are grandchildren and sons and daughters of the original refugees, and universally they tell me, we didn't know very much. Our parents never talked about this stuff. There was one incident which I'll mention. I'll keep it short. One of the crew members of the Kirk, one of the officers, retired from the Navy. He lives in the Newport, Rhode Island area, and because he's a retired Navy, he gets his medical care through the Naval Health Clinic there. And he went recently, within the last 2 years, for his annual physical, and the Navy doctor that he was given for his care had a Vietnamese name. His name was Con Van Nguyen. And Hugh Doyle, this former sailor of the Kirk, he said, I noticed that you have a Vietnamese name. Could you tell me how your family got here? And the young man said that he was only 5 years old, and his parents never talked about it. He knew he came on a ship, but whenever he would ask, his parents would clam up or they would change the subject. But it turns out, as they exchanged information, it turned out that his family was in that flotilla, was rescued by the USS Kirk. And the irony is, as Hugh Doyle now says, what are the odds that this family would have made it out of Vietnam intact? What are the odds they would have made it to the United States? They would have educated one of their sons as a physician. That doctor now would join the Navy. He would end up stationed at the naval base in Newport, Rhode Island, and he would become my doctor.
Wow. I am so caught up in this. I wasn't paying attention to the clock. We got 20 seconds. Jan, thank you so much. The book is called The Lucky Few. The documentary is The Lucky Few. That's on YouTube tonight. The other movie he mentioned, The Last Days in Vietnam, is on PBS at 9 o'clock, I think, tonight.
Yes.
And real quickly, do you have a website, Jan?
I don't have a website, but the book is available, as you say, in paperback. It's available just about anywhere. You can get it from the Naval Institute Press, or certainly you can get it from Amazon.
Okay. Jan Herman, thank you so much, and thank you for your service. Wonderful thing you're doing. I appreciate the fact that you took some time to be with us today.
It was all my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
All right, we'll be right back.
To protect its merchandise, we saw a group of almost 10, I would say, young to teenage-looking boys lifting up the gate, screaming expletives at us and everybody else on the street, breaking glass and rushing in.